Oh, and welcome to the Bars Digital events. I'm really proud that we're the first event of 2021 after a very successful run of events last year, all of which I think are still available to view online if you missed them. Tonight is Burns Night Supper, and I'm just going to put into the chat a hashtag for you to tweet should you wish, which is virtual Burns Supper. And I think Glasgow University are looking for people to send images of the virtual evenings that they're having. So you might want to take a picture of us or take a picture of what you're eating and drinking for this event. I pitched the Burns Night Supper as a convivial and sort of conversational evening to sort of celebrate Robert Burns, who was born however many years ago yesterday, and there were sort of celebrations going on around the world, and we're sort of continuing the celebration today, and I think they're continuing until at least the end of the week. Jerry was saying it before we began, and I've decided to structure this digital event after a traditional structure of a Burns supper. So we're going to have a range of traditional toasts, and then we're going to have a range of traditional entertainments. I think they probably should be interleaved, but for the sake of clarity, we're going to have toasts, and then we're going to have entertainments. The toasts are going to be short, more or less academic discussions on Robert Burns, on elements to do with whisky distilling, which I think is really exciting, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and also about Scottish Romanticism more generally. And then we're going to segue into some poetry reading, and I think poetry reading is a really significant part, as well as whisky drinking, of a traditional Burns supper. And certainly Burns suppers that I've enjoyed have sort of developed beyond a celebration of Robert Burns to a celebration of all different kinds of poetry. So we're going to start with Burns, of course, and we're going to hear some Burns poetry, but then we're going to hear some new and contemporary poems, and then the third entertainment, so that's the sort of first and second entertainment, the third entertainment is sort of open to the audience for you to come and share poetry with us. And that can be poetry by Robert Burns that you would like to read out and share with us. It can be poetry by other people. I think Matthew was joking about reading The Revolt of Islam by Percy Bysshe Shelley, a famously long poem, but we might run out of time for that. So the structure of the evening is going to be toasts after the tradition of a Burns supper, followed by entertainments, and finishing with an entertainment that is kind of open to you, and that's part of the sort of open spirit of conviviality and conversation and celebration that this Burns Night Supper is aiming for. I'm going to introduce our speakers as they sort of talk to us, because I think that will sort of set them up nicely. And I'm going to start with Jerry Carruthers, and sort of I've got an official readout to do, and then an unofficial one that I wanted to come up with. And I wanted to sort of start with a significant figure from Burns studies, and my friend Jenny Orr said you have to get Jerry if you can. So you come highly recommended by a mutual friend, I think, Jerry. But Jerry Carruthers is general editor of the Oxford University Press multi-volume edition of the collected works of Robert Burns. Published next month is his co-edited Performing Robert Burns, and I think Matthew's going to put a link in the chat for you to have a look at this, should you wish. And he asked if I had time, and we certainly have time, because you're our first speaker and our sort of keynote speaker, as it were. He asked to end with a plug for the new Edinburgh University Press Burns Chronicle, a peer-reviewed journal for which he is co-editor for, and which he is actively seeking submissions for. So what Jerry is going to do is address the haggis, and then he is going to give the toast to the immortal memory of Robert Burns. So we're going to start with some poetry in line with the sort of ethos of the event, and then we're going to hear about the immortal memory of Robert Burns, and then I will introduce our next speaker. Over to you, Jerry.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. Fair for your honest sonsy face, great chieftain of the puddin race. Aboon them all, ye tak your place, pinch, tripe or therm, wheeler ye worthy of a grace, as lang's my The groaning trencher, there ye fill, your hurdies like a distant hill. Your pin would help to mend a mill in time o' need, while through your pores the dews distill like amber beads. His knife, sae rustic labour dicht, and cut ye up wi' ready slicht, trenching your gushing entrails bricht, like ony ditch, and then, oh, what a glorious sicht, warm reeking, rich. Then horn for horn they stretch and strive, deal tack the hindmost, on they drive, till all their wheel-swelled kites belive are bent like drums. Then old Goodman maist like to arrive, bethank it hums. Is there that o'er his French ragout, or olio that would sta a stew, or fricassee would mak her spew, with perfect scunner, looks down wi' nearing scornful view, on sick a dinner. Poor devil, see him o'er his trash, as feckless as a withered rash, his spindle shank a good whiplash, his nieve a knit, throw bloody flood or fail to dash, oh how unfit. But mark the rustic haggis fed, the trembling earth resounds his tread. Clap in his wally nieve a blade, he'll mak it whistle, and legs and arms and heads will sned like taps a thistle. You powers who mak mankind your care, and dish them out their bill of fare. Old Scotland wants nae skinking ware that jops and luggies, but if ye wish her grateful prayer, gear a haggis. The haggis. So it falls to me also to provide an immortal memory, as is the tradition. Robert Burns died 225 years ago, and we are celebrating him still, this great international world writer. The rhinestone ploughboy, the spicy peasant dish, Burns as well as the haggis. And if we think a wee bit about the afterlife to begin with, Burns might have been Scotland's greatest poet. That's open to debate. He is certainly Scotland's greatest songwriter. And there is this wonderful thing where Burns moves from classical reception to traditional, or what we would call folk tradition, and even to pop music. We've got Beethoven, we've got Liszt, we've got Haydn, we've got Arvo Part more recently, we've got James Macmillan. We have the likes of Jean Redpath, who shared the flat with Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan learned of Burns through her and through the great Irish folk group, the Clancys, in the early 60s in New York. And we move on, for instance, to people like Paolo Nutini, Eddie Reader, etc. Burns gives us a clue to, Dylan gives us a clue to Burns, the great romantic lyricist, because Dylan identifies the sheer expressiveness that Burns brings, which is something that Burns contributes to a burgeoning European romantic song canon. We've got Auld Lang Syne among the greatest hits, the third most sung song around the world, I almost said that right, along with For He's a Jolly Good Fellow and Happy Birthday. Auld Lang Syne though, it's one of these things where it's not inevitable that it becomes a great song, although it is a great song, written in the late 18th century at a time of emigration, at a time of various kinds of population dislocation. So it's a great song of parting, even though Burns takes the original lyric from essentially the British Civil War, about two comrades parting after a battle, and he universalizes it. But actually, the short version of what goes on with Auld Lang Syne is that it's propelled around the world, not just because of its innate greatness, not because of inevitable cause and effect, but because of the age of radio. The Guy Lombardo Canadian-Italian dance band integrated into their celebrations of New Year in New York in the 20s. Radio comes along, and that propels the song around the world. Very often, accident goes along with greatness. But in Burns, there certainly is greatness. And he's a very appropriate poet for Scotland and beyond because he is ecumenical. He is promiscuous in not only his affairs with women, and we can't get round that, at least 13 women, at least 5 women pregnant on 5 occasions. This is comparable, say, to Marlon Brando or Bob Marley. He's in that kind of league, nothing to boast about. But also we might say in terms of that promiscuous sensibility, Burns has great sympathy for a range of identities. Contrary to popular belief, sympathy was not invented by Oprah Winfrey, but by Adam Smith, more or less, in 1759, the year that Burns was born, in fact, in his Theory of Moral Sentiments, a book that Burns prized very much. Burns, on the one hand, will celebrate, for instance, Mary Queen of Scots, a despotic Stuart Catholic queen, and even worse, a woman. And at the other extreme, he will celebrate the Covenanters, those harsh Calvinists who in the late 17th century said, we're not going to tell the king how we ought to worship, we will follow our conscience. And in the aftermath of the French Revolution, Burns refracts the Covenanters through the Jacobins and says, these are also people following their conscience. These are people of principle. So Catholic queen at one extreme, at the other end, hardline Calvinist. Burns knows there's more than one way of being Scottish. There's more than one way of being human. The great 15th century Scottish poet William Dunbar said there was no music in hell except for the bagpipes. And there speaks the typical lowland poet. Robert Burns comes along and quite uniquely for a lowland poet writes sympathetically of the Highlander. In his poem Address of Beelzebub, 1786, although not published for more than 20 years after his death because it was too hot to handle, Burns has the Earl of Breadalbane, who in real life refused to allow Highlanders to emigrate to Canada because they were starving. He has the Earl of Breadalbane addressed by Beelzebub, not the devil. If we know our Milton, we know that Beelzebub is probably the chief treasurer in hell. And Beelzebub, through the ironic cadences of the poem, says, this is great. You're refusing to let them leave the land, even though they're starving. Let's put their children to labour. Let's take their women and make them prostitutes in Drury Lane. Let's dehumanise them. And of course, the ironic anger inherent in that poem is where Burns is saying that the Highlander is also a human being, someone worthy of respect. And we find this time and again, not just because it was a good chat-up line, but Burns would write letters to women, very often aristocratic women, sometimes even quite old and ugly ones. And the point was that he knew that women would give him a hearing in terms of helping him critique his own work. This is a real facet of Burns. He has at least 3 female confidants who help him with his work, the 2 most prominent being Lady Dawn and Mrs. Dunlop. Burns, the poet who writes of God or Mother Nature, who is a woman, her apprentice hand, she tried on man, and then she made the lasses o'. That's not just Burns being cute. Burns believed mentally, even if there were problems elsewhere in his biography, in the equality of women. And one other poem we might briefly think about in terms of Burns and the Enlightenment legacy, the Smithian legacy. He's a great poet of humanity, not because he's a peasant poet, although to some extent he is. He is a great poet because he has been reading Enlightenment tomes. He's a product of the Ayrshire Enlightenment, and that involves thinking about things like psychology. I noticed that there's some kind person here from Kilwinning, which is in Ayrshire, an interesting place with a rather checkered reputation, where Burns was inducted as a Freemason. Whenever I use that phrase, Ayrshire Enlightenment, I have a friend who knows or thinks that he can shout that down and disprove that term Ayrshire Enlightenment in one word, and that one word he shouts at me is Kilwinning, which supposedly is a horrible, benighted place, but it isn't at all. But Burns, as part of the Ayrshire Enlightenment, is interested in analysing human behaviour theoretically, psychologically, etc., etc. And we see this in his great poem To a Louse. In To a Louse, Jenny is standing in the church and she's a babe, and she knows she's a babe, and she's aware of the male gaze, and she thinks all those blokes are looking at me because I'm a babe, and they are looking at her because she's a babe. But what she doesn't realise is that there is an insect crawling on her. This is a poem about misdirected perception. Jenny isn't paying attention to God. She's aware with the eyes in the back of her head of the male gaze. The males are looking at her, but not quite. They're looking at the insect. No one is paying attention to the minister or God. And part of the kind of thematic texture of the poem is that Burns is saying that's how it is. We've all got an inner Homer Simpson. We all sit there not paying attention to the things we ought to. And that is the poem that famously ends, or more or less ends, "Oh, would some power the gift they gie us to see ourselves as others see us." And that is Burns riffing on the Smithian concept of sympathy. Smith and Burns believed that putting oneself in the place of another, whether that's a Covenanter or a Stuart Queen or whoever, was good. We should try and walk in one another's shoes, because that is the cement of society. That is a kind of act of sociability that Burns extends through history to previously marginalised things like Calvinists and Highlanders and Scottish Queens, and also in the here and now. Into a Louse, there is sympathy for Jenny, even as she's been taken down a peg or two, because that is one of the great poems where Burns says we are all part of nature. We're not separate from nature. And the louse crawling on Jenny also symbolises that. And the morbid subtext is it does kind of recall the grave, the worm, the insect, the return to dust. No matter our finery, no matter our airs and graces, as he says in the poem, all of that eventually crumbles. It crumbles in the end in death, but less morbidly in life, we should make it crumble to reach out to one another in human terms. And that's why it's been quite remarkable that over this Burns season, there have been so many virtual Burns suppers, and that's wonderful. As if we need reminding that we need community, we need sympathy for one another. Burns is often seen as a great Scottish poet, and he was, but ultimately he was more interested in human life wherever it came from, and we shouldn't let the Scots, and the Scots have been bad at this, in sort of cordoning Burns off as though he's our property only. He's a great romantic poet, and I think most people here realise that, and he needs to be claimed as a romantic poet, as a world poet. Just to kind of end, I might make mention of what Andy referred to earlier. We've got a wonderful Burns supper project being curated by the very wonderful Paul McGratty, a researcher on that. Paul's from France. His parents recently have had to make their own haggis because due to Brexit, there is a haggis shortage in France. If you had no other reason for despising Brexit, there you go, whether you're French or not. But the Burns Supper project we have been putting together, and you can see the map, the website is mentioned there in the chat. Burns Suppers over the last 5 years, but really we're talking about the first Burns Supper being in 1801, we've got Burns Suppers recorded in 5 continents and in 150 countries, and that's not all of them. And at the top of Kilimanjaro, in the trenches in World War I, all over the place. My favourite one currently, probably shouldn't say this given that this is going out on YouTube, but my favourite one is the Swingers Club in Blackpool, where the entertainment is recorded as mass orgy with strangers. There is a bit of me that thinks that Burns would have approved of that too, but have a look at the variety of Burns suppers, the way in which we've got reggae Burns suppers in Glasgow, not in the West Indies, but hopefully in the West Indies too, the way in which we've got fusion cuisine at Burns suppers, kangaroo and haggis in Sydney. In Vancouver, we've got Chinese cuisine and haggis. This is a veritable multicultural feast, the kind of celebration that we're having for Burns tonight. And that is very suitable because Burns was in so many ways, as I've tried to point to, multicultural. Robert Burns is a man who immortalizes all kinds of human nature. And so it's appropriate, I think, that in turn he has been remembered for 225 years since his death in all kinds of ways. So I would ask you please to raise a glass and to toast the immortal memory of Robert Burns. Robert Burns.
Thank you so much for that, Jerry. That was a wonderful immortal memory toast, and a lovely way of thinking about Burns as a songwriter with an important and exceptional international legacy, also as a romantic poet, as you were saying, embedded in Enlightenment debates, and also with a real sort of complex and intricate relationship and series of relationships with women, and that's taking us nicely into the second toast, which is called An Address to the Lassies. And when I was thinking about who to invite for Address to the Lassies, one of the things I kept in my mind was that these Bars Digital events stipulate that there should be PhD or ECR engagement in each of the events, and in the recess of my mind, I remembered a wonderful PhD advert from a while ago on the history and archaeology of whisky distilleries, and I thought, who got that? And a brief Google search told me that Darroch Bratt, who is going to be our next toaster or next speaker, was the person who got that. He says he's a PhD student researching the historical archaeology of whisky distilling, and I asked if he was able to give a toast to the lassies and talk about, as the slide says, women in the history of whisky distilling, and he answered very positively and enthusiastically that he would, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing about his project. So welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And yes, I must be the most lucky PhD student in the world. This is actually this is a very short toast, and it's based on a bit of my PhD that I wish I could have done more on. And what I'm going to explore is the history of women as whiskey distillers and smugglers and commercial distillers and merchants. But I thought this picture is a really good one to start with. It's a picture by Edwin Landseer depicting an illicit whiskey still, and I think it's a really good picture for showing us how we perceive illicit distilling, because there in the light is a man. Everyone is looking at him. He looks very stoic and very heroic, and he's in all this Highland finery. But actually, when you look closer at the picture, it tells us something more. There are two men here, and there are three women, and everyone's sort of directing their gaze at this man, and it tells us so much about how we see the history of whiskey. So I want to convince everyone that that's not the history of whiskey, and I'll start that by going through whiskey through time, essentially. So the earliest distillers, apart from the sort of very early monks and friars who were making whiskey, the first real domestic distillers that we see emerge in the 16th century, and they are selling whiskey as part of an extension of a household economy. And these people had very little attention in academia. And in going through the borough court records from Inverness, I actually found that in the 1560s, there were 40 distilleries in this tiny town of Inverness. And out of those 40 distilleries, 37 were run by women. And they continued for a few years in those borough court records until a license was brought in. And the 4 licenses that were granted, 3 went to men and 1 to a woman. It's quite likely that the ones that were granted to men were actually operated by women as well. So they appear to have operated locally, sold their products locally, and also contributed to their own household consumption. But we also know that they were exporting from Inverness to the Western Isles at that point. So it's really quite interesting commercial activity there. This sort of production continued for at least 200 years. Mary Monroe of Inverary in the 1730s, no, in fact, 1718, was recorded as having her house burnt to the ground by an accidental fire caused by an aquavitae pot. Aquavitae being an early name for whiskey, meaning water of life. And Thomas Pennant in the 1770s also described distilling as an extension of a woman's domestic duty. So quite a long history of domestic production there. This changed really quickly in the 1780s. In 1784, the Wash Act made it very difficult to operate in the Highlands as a legal distiller, and only people with a lot of capital were able to do that legally. But it became a very integral part of the economy, partly because the legislation kind of created the perfect conditions for distilling. And Burns, as an exciseman, gave us quite a lot of information about how people felt about this and how he felt about it. And I thought I'd read a very small extract from his earnest cry and prayer. Paint Scotland greeting o'er her thistle, how much can scout as tones a whistle? A damned exciseman in a bustle, seizing a stell, triumphant, crushing it like a mussel or lampet shell. Then, until her hand present her, a blackguard smuggler right behind her, and cheek for chow a chuffy vintner, collegian join, picking her pouch as bare as winter, o' a kind of coin. Tell young good blood, all Becunnock, I'll be his debt to mash lambannocks, and drink his health in old Nats tunnocks 9 times a week, if he some scheme like tea and winnocks would kindly seek. We often see smuggling as quite a male-dominated activity, but actually women were still front and center of illicit distillation and smuggling. And one of the things I wanted to do in this talk was mention women by name, individual women where I could find them in the records, or at least refer to individuals. And one of the people who I felt like I came to know quite well through, through an NRS record was Anne Mackay, who gave evidence to a precognition of an unfortunate murder at an illicit distilling bothy in Strathconnan, and that was in 1834. Now, apart from the sad circumstances of that, her evidence was very, very interesting, because it's the only evidence I've really come across about what a night at an illicit distilling bothy was like that doesn't come from a man, and usually a middle-class man. But this was a woman who was really involved in the production. They also were the smugglers as well as the producers. A really good story is told of an Abriacan woman, and Abriacan's about 5 miles from where I am now by Loch Ness. An Abriacan woman was taking her wares into Inverness, a big jug of illicitly distilled whiskey. And she was prevented from getting to Inverness by a gauger. So she feigned weakness and told the gauger that she was near fainting, and that the least he could do would be to allow her a sip of the whiskey from the jug to restore her. Being a gentleman, he obliged. She then spat all the whiskey straight into his eyes and made off with the whole jug. And women were actually really important in these in this enforcement and deception. Many instances of crowds of women assembling en masse to deforce gaugers and excisemen are recorded in the 1800s. Indeed, quite a lot of men dressed as women in order to deforce gaugers. And at the other end of this illicit economy, there were the shebeeners, and on the legal side, there were innkeepers. Theresa Mackay's fantastic article in 2017 on women innkeepers talks about Janet Mclaren, who was an innkeeper. And she was so much more than an innkeeper, actually. What we see about her role was someone who procured and sold whisky, both legal and illicit, but she was also an employer and a creditor. She sort of operated as a rural bank. And then you have the more illegal side, and a real character emerges in the character of Eppie Lucky Thane from Duff Defiance. And she ran a shebeen in Glenknochty. Now, this picture that you can see here is the very corner of that shebeen. And the day I was there, it was raining so hard that this is the only picture that actually showed any identifiable archaeology at all. But actually, in the very back wall, you can see slight phases of rebuilding, and her shebeen was repeatedly knocked down and then built back up by daylight. And then later in the 18th century, the women of the Maggot, a very deprived area in Inverness, were constantly harangued by law enforcement for selling illicit whiskey from their homes. So there's a sort of entrepreneurial history of whiskey women engaged in whiskey from an early time. And then you've got, at the other end of this story, you've got the entrepreneurs. Often these were people who had started as illicit distillers but went legal. And perhaps the best known people for this were Helen and Elizabeth Cumming of Cardew. Helen Cumming, as a smuggler, used to show great ingenuity by inviting excisemen into her distillery, which she had disguised as a bakery. While she entertained them with tea, she'd go outside and raise a red flag. The red flag would let all the other distillers in the area know that the gaugers were about, and they'd have an unsuccessful day of it. But she went legit and founded Cardew Distillery, which became a sort of founding distillery in the Johnnie Walker brand. She handed off her distillery to Elizabeth Cumming, her daughter-in-law, and she expanded it and joined this Johnnie Walker brand, which has been acknowledged by Johnnie Walker in the introduction of their character Jane Walker, who's also up on screen here. So what I hope I've shown you in this very short toast is that women weren't background characters. They were the risk takers, they were the innovators, and they were the drivers and the managers of the whiskey industry, illicit or legal. And we've got women to thank for what we have in our hands today. So I would propose we raise a toast to the lassies.
That was fabulous. Thank you so much for that. And what a wonderful toast to the lassies, and giving us a real insight, or me a real insight into the history of women's role as smugglers and illegal and legal distillers. I think that was really fascinating. Thank you very much. The next toast in the series of a traditional Burns night is a response to that toast from a woman. So it's a reply to the laddies, and that honour goes to my friend Ainsley McIntosh, who I don't think is going to have to run away to resolve any smuggling raids on her study. I think it's all fine. This is an entirely unprofessional segue, but I first met Ainsley when at bars in Cardiff, when we were on a coach to see Tintern Abbey, and perhaps in the spirit of this evening, we got to Tintern Abbey and saw a pub, and both of us, I think, were attracted more to the pub than the romantic ruins next to us. And we sort of quickly made a tour of Tintern Abbey, and then ended up in the pub, attracting more and more people to us in that sort of convivial way. But more professionally, she's a research assistant on the Edinburgh edition of Walter Scott's poetry and the Scott's Chapbook project. She edited the recent edition of Marmion, and will be editing Rokeby next, and is here to give the next host in sequence, which is the reply to the daddies. Thank you very much, Ainsley.
Thank you for that introduction as well. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? I think they're brilliant. All right, perfect. So basically just dive straight in, and I'm going to briefly sort of outline one of the key findings from my work on Marmion, and I think is one, well, hopefully you'll agree that it speaks particularly well to the spirit of tonight's event. So the excuse me, sorry, now. Oops, sorry, excuse me, I can't get my slide to move on, which would be a real shame. Oops, sorry, excuse me everyone for 1 minute. I'll just try and work out what's happened here. Right, here we go. Okay, so what became the volume Marmion, which was published in 2018 as part of the Edinburgh edition of Walter Scott's poetry. It really began its life as my doctoral thesis. For that thesis, I offered a model for editing this poem. And at the very outset of that project, I think there was a slight fear that perhaps I might simply just find myself replicating the work that had already been done on the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley novels. But what was really exciting was that when I began to look at Marmion and then subsequent poems by Scott, something emerged that was altogether very different. So it was a kind of an exciting key difference. And this really kind of offered the chance to kind of alter the methodology that we had used, or that had been used, to look at the novels. With this key difference, it really comes down to a difference in circumstances of production. As we all know, Scott wrote the Waverley novels under the cloak of anonymity, and he very successfully maintained that up until 1827. So basically, for almost the whole bulk of his career as a novelist, he was the great unknown. But the things were very different indeed when, in the case of the poetry. It was the poetry that Scott built his fame on, and he openly avowed authorship. And so what this meant was, this meant that they were produced in very different circumstances. And this had implications for the development of all of Scott's poetry, but I think particularly so for Marmion. I'm just going to share, this is a fairly typical leaf of the manuscript, which I just thought would be nice for you to have a look at while I'm talking here in the background. So unlike other Scott works, their genesis in Scott's reading or in the historical record, Marmion was really born out of conversations and exchanges that took place between Scott and his friends. So, for example, it was ideas and information that he exchanged in letters with his friend Robert Surtees that exerted a really significant influence over this poem when it was initially taking shape in Scott's mind. And there was a wide circle of friends and acquaintances who continued to provide the context for writing this poem. Scott shared and discussed details about Marmion very freely. For example, we've got multiple accounts of him reading or performing parts of Marmion while it's still in the very early stages of its composition. So in sort of doing this, what Scott effectively did was to enter into a dialogue with his audience and to allow that audience to offer a critique of his work as it was still in development. His listeners and his correspondents would offer suggestions for revisions, and on two notable occasions, Scott actually duly alters the text of the poem as a direct result of these kind of interactions. In the majority of instances, however, Scott resisted direct criticism from his friends. But what is clear is that this kind of process of reading aloud to them and receiving these responses, it caused a readjustment to take place in his own mind. And I call this a process of poetic adjustment socialization. So what makes Marmion so interesting, one of the things that makes it so interesting, is that this is the first work in which we see Scott engage in this kind of self-criticism. We see this taking place in his later works and in the novels, but it's different. This is different because it's in the proof stage here that we first see his responsiveness to this kind of audience interaction. Now, what surprised me even more was that Scott continues with this process of improvement to the text even after the first edition is published. So in the second and again in the third edition, Scott continues to revise lines, to alter notes, and he even adds in new lines and notes up until the third edition. Now, some of these changes are due to Scott's ongoing creative engagement with the poem himself. So you've got an example of this here. This is one of my collation sheets from the third edition. And you'll see there at the bottom, penciled in, it's 3 lines that Scott has decided at this point to add into the text of the poem. So this is clearly something that, you know, this is arising from Scott's own creativity. But what is also clear is that in other instances, Scott's continuing to respond directly to input from his audience. And so if this particularly happens with the notes, Scott's audience continues to shape the notes. But what also happens in this instance is that they become written into the text of the poem themselves. Again, just to offer you one example of this. So this is an addition that Scott makes to a note. Again, this is in the third edition of the poem. And basically what he's saying here is that he's had a conversation or some kind of maybe an exchange with his friend Lord Napier. Lord Napier has provided extra information which causes Scott to alter the note, so he improves the note. So Scott's writing this information into the text, but he's also acknowledging the source of that information as well. And I think, again, this just really illustrates the intensely kind of sociable context in which this poem is shaped and developed. And we can see evidence of that as well in the shape of the conversation poems that precede each of the cantos of this poem. We know that Scott's life was intensely sociable in 1807, the year in which he was writing this. He's staying with friends in Edinburgh and London. And so those poems are addressed to these friends he's been staying with. He makes reference to topical social and political events of the day. And in these conversation poems, they may well be, they may well relate to conversations that have actually taken place between Scott and these friends. And what I should also mention here is the speed with which these early editions of the poem are being produced. So basically 3 editions of Marmion had sold out within the first 3 months of its publication. In a letter in May 1808, Scott very nicely describes how the 3rd edition is currently thundering its way through the press. And I think that very nicely conveys that sense of rapidity and the energy with which these early editions are being produced. And as I've kind of already mentioned, the text is continuing to develop during this very rapid period of production. So not only did this process of socialisation have a profound effect on Marmion's development, it had implications for me when I was trying to decide upon an appropriate textual policy. I faced the challenge of having to consider how my edition could capture this ongoing process of creative engagement and conversation that was taking place within the text. So on the grounds that Scott continued to be artistically involved with the text up until the 3rd edition, and also given that very rapid, very short time that had elapsed between the printing of the 1st and the 3rd editions, I elected to use the 3rd edition for my base text. And further research has shown that this general principle can be applied to editing the rest of Scott's poetry too. We have a very helpful guide for editors, which we will refer to. I'm not going to read this, but just to paraphrase, the general principle is that for each volume of the edition, the editor will choose the earliest fully articulated and coherent form of the poem. And this is usually always something that has been produced in what we would term the initial creative process. So I think that pretty much out of time, but I felt like it was particularly appropriate to share the story of creativity being shaped and informed by sociability and exchange and performativity, given the kind of nature of the event that we're all engaged in tonight, where we're sharing ideas and exchanging conviviality, and we're enjoying the performance of papers and poetry. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ainsley. That was lovely, and a lovely insight into the editorial process that went on in sort of both Walter Scott's own time and then in your own experience with the poem. And that stressing of sociability and conviviality was very much appreciated for tonight. So we should raise a glass to Scott as well as Burns, and to you for that wonderful toast. So that's our three traditional toasts. So I guess we should imagine now that we've whizzed through maybe a cockaliki soup, a haggis, neeps and tatties, and a cranachan that I'm particularly longing for this year. So cranachan, if you don't know, is a sort of raspberries, cream, whiskey, and oats mess, which is delicious. But apparently we're on a diet, so that's not on the menu for me tonight. But yes, so we've whizzed through them, and we're getting to the entertainment section of the evening. So we're going to have some poetry reading, and at the beginning of this evening, I mentioned that you were also, as the audience, invited to participate in this. So if you want to line up some poetry reading for a moment, you can. And I remembered this partway through our pre-meeting to discover if we were all technically ready, and brought some poems up to inflict on you all, should that become required. So we're going to first of all hear from Jim Kelly, who has, again, a professional introduction, which I'll read out in a moment, and then a less professional introduction, which I'm also going to inflict on him, which is, when I was trying to cast this evening with a dramatist personae, as it were, I was thinking about who I'd like to invite to read some poetry, and I have some very fond memories of working down in Cornwall, which is where Jim works, as you'll find out in his more professional biography in a moment, where Jim provided us with cockaliki soup and haggis, neeps and tatties, and a delicious cranachan, and also, as I remember, what he termed dirty blackberries, which were sort of foraged blackberries muddled with whisky, which was particularly delicious, and also invited us to bring poems and share poems and read out and even sing poetry in those Burns Night evenings. So Jim was sort of top of my list for someone to lead us off in a poetry reading of Burns. He also says, again more professionally, that he's a senior lecturer at the Combined History and English Department of Humanities Penryn at the University of Exeter's Cornwall campus. He's written extensively on Irish literature in the Romantic period, including essays on the influence of Burns on both 19th century Irish cultural nationalism and the use of folklore in Gothic writing. He did his PhD at the University of Edinburgh, leaving him a Scotophile for life. Over to you, Jim, for the first of our entertainments.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to read To a Louse. After Jerry's reading of To a Haggis, I dare not try a Scottish accent, so this will be Robert Burns via Roddy Doyle, I think. It's going to be a little bit of Northside Dublin, because that's where I'm from. So it might go into Scottishness a little bit at some point, because you can't really avoid it with the language, you know what I mean? But this is To a Louse on seeing one on a lady's bonnet at church. Ha, where you going, you crawling fairly? Your impudence protects you sairly. I canna say but you strunt rarely, all gauze and lace. Though faith, I fear you dine but sparely in such a place. You ugly, creeping, blasted oneer, detested, shunned by saint and sinner, how dare you set your feet upon her, so fine a lady? Go somewhere else and seek your dinner on some poor body. Swith, in some beggar's half-a-squattle, there you may creep and sprawl and sprattle with other kindred jumping cattle in shoals and nations, where horn nor bane nor dare unsettle your thick plantations. Now hold you there, you're out of sight, below the fatrals, snug and tight. Ah, na, fecha, yeah, you'll no be right till you've got on it, the very topmost towering height of Mrs. Bonnet. My sooth, right bold you hold your nose out, as plump and grey as any groza. Oh, for some rank and mercuria rosa, or fell red smedum, I'd give you such a hearty dose of it, would dress your drodden. I wouldn't have been surprised to see you on some old wife's flannan toy, or Abel's some bit duddy boys on Wiles' coat. But Mrs. Final and Hardy, fie, how dare you do it? Oh, Jenny, dinna toss your head and set your beauties all abread. You little ken what cursed speed the blast he's making. Thy winks and finger ends I dread are notice taken. Was some power the gifty gies, to see ourselves as others see us, would from many a blunder free us and foolish notion, where airs in dress and gait would leave us, and even devotion. I'll go back into my Northside Dublin hole now.
Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. So we're moving on to our second entertainment now, and this is sort of deliberately structured to take us sort of beyond Burns, as I guess the toasts also did. So we started with a wonderful immortal memory on the global impact of Burns, and then we thought about whisky distilling with some a lovely sort of perspective from Burns in it, and then we sort of expanded to editorial practices in Scott, and we're going to move on now from that wonderful reading of To a Louse to some of Zayneb's own poetry. So I was just going to introduce Zayneb as a poet, and then I was chatting to her over one of our Zoom coffees last week, and she definitively said she was not a poet, which left me a little bit stumped. So she's provided a biography which is going to apparently segue into her poetry reading itself. I want to sort of specify that she, as well as all the other things that she says she is, I discovered last week that she's also now the associate director of our research institute, which I think is worth saying in a biography. So she's the associate director of our Institute of Creative Enterprise, which is worth trumpeting. But she's also a writer rather than specifically a poet, and senior lecturer in creative writing at Edgehill University, which is where I'm also from. She's published poetry and creative critical writing, or unidentified literary objects, as we started to call it. Her debut poetry pamphlet, Keine Angst, which is, I guess, a good German saying for coronavirus lockdown times, no worries, was published by New Walk Editions. Her poems have featured in several journals, and most recently on the Dial a Poem mobile app, which I also meant to cut and paste for you, Matthew, but perhaps you can find it and put it in the chat. So the Dial a Poem mobile app, download it to your phone and call her on 7722. She's also a lockdown cliche, having rented a piano and started Zoom lessons last autumn. She thinks it's just about true that most poets really want to be musicians instead.
Thanks, Andy. Hello, everybody. And thank you, Bars, for inviting me this evening. I've loved listening. It's been so interesting. So a little preamble, and then I'm going to read a short poem. Andy mentioned that I'm a lockdown cliche, and that's part of what makes the poem I'm going to read, is part of what makes it seem pertinent to me. Deciding what to read at a lockdown burn supper had me thinking about faith. If you're not religious like me, where do you find it? In the middle of yet another lockdown, on yet another day of rain and cold, in a market town in West Lancashire, I need some faith. Before Christmas, my piano teacher suggested that I get some manuscript paper. He said, just get it, and then one day when you feel like composing something, you can. It's still completely blank because I'm still completely scared of it, like I am most of the time with any kind of writing, and that's part of why I said to Andy, don't tell them that I'm a poet. But I thought, what are lockdowns for if not hobbies? So I decided to press on a bit and try to arrange some Christmas carols. I thought I could have a go at that in December. So I ended up listening to O Holy Night over and over again, which is really a poem. It's written by the French poet Placide Cappeau in the mid-19th century, and then put to music by the composer and music critic Adolphe Adam, also French, in 1847. And the English version that I was mostly listening to over and over again was written by John Sullivan Dwight in 1855. So the first part of the verse was pretty easy to work out an arrangement for. You know it, I'm sure. It goes, "O holy night, the stars are brightly shining. It is the night of our dear Saviour's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth." Then it goes, "A thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn." And then there's a chorus. "Fall on your knees, oh hear the angel voices, O night divine, O night when Christ was born, O night divine, O night divine." So I kept going over and over it. From a thrill of hope, I couldn't work out how to get it to happen on the piano. It needed to sound gilded and light and full of awe. I found myself constantly singing it as if to unlock a secret. "A thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices, for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn. Fall on your knees." Then, one day, in the middle of all the piano angst, there was an annunciation, kind of. Jon Snow on Channel 4 announced that there was going to be a COVID vaccine. "A thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices," I immediately said out loud to an empty room, "for yonder breaks a new and glorious morn." And then I texted my friend, "I just heard about the vaccine and it's just like in O Holy Night, a thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices." And OMG, they were singing that in 1850. Thus, we have no option but to conclude that the world was ever weary, laughing emoji times 10. And he texted back, "Fall on your knees, behold the angels' voices, O night divine, hands praying emoji times 10, OMG. I literally adore this news." So the short poem that I'm going to read is about an adoration, not the adoration, but maybe not a million miles away. It's a story about a much needed thrill of hope that I was reminded of, and it was all I needed for a little faith. It's called Last Christmas, and it's for Ahmed. "I implored the ceiling, like Topple in Fiddler on the Roof, only vicious. Would just one person in this fucking house ever say it as it is?" No answer. Later, I bargained with the dark. "Help me. I need one person to say one true thing." "You met me in the morning. I was bearing punchlines to give you about the day, the glittering lie. You said, 'I've started dating guys.' As the cafe clattered and steamed, I drew a speech bubble around your words, gilded it while I drank my coffee, listening to you and adoring your honest mouth." From me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zayneb. I adore that. So, like there are 3 toasts, and we've heard from Gerry, Darroch and Ainsley, there should be 3 entertainments, and we've heard from Jim and Zayneb, and now it's sort of over to you. So I guess if you have questions, because the toasts and the poetry readings have been so wonderful, you can ask a question in the chat, or you can just say that you have a question, and you can possibly sense my preference here, or if you would like to read a poem or perform a poem or present a poem, or by Burns or by anybody else, which is quite an ask, you're welcome also to say that. So you can say that in the chat, and then you can unmute and possibly even show yourself. So there's a lot of blank spaces, and I think at the beginning we were saying that maybe at this point it would be okay if you wanted to unblank yourself, you can pop into our Burns supper now, and hopefully it won't take up too much of our bandwidth. And if you'd like to ask a question, or if you'd like to read a poem, please volunteer. Oh, we've got like a range of things have gone on. What a wonderful event. I have an extract from Joanna Bailey, says Gillian, and then some thanks for Zayneb's wonderful poem. But Gillian, would you like? Oh, I love Joanna Bailey, our modern Shakespeare, as they said in the Romantic period. So if Gillian would like to unmute herself, I would love to hear some Joanna Bailey for the beginning of our third entertainment, and other people can scrabble and get poetry if they need to. Is Gillian here?
I am. I'm right here.
Oh, hello. give us your best Joanna Bailey. Welcome.
I'll do my best. I'll do my best. Okay. It's A Winter Day is quite a long poem by Joanna Bailey, so I'm only going to give you the very last stanza because I think it's possibly appropriate for the evening and for the weather that we've got at the moment. But long accustomed to observe the weather, the labourer cannot lay him down in peace, till he has looked to mark what bodes the night. He turns the heavy door, thrusts out his head, sees wreaths of snow heaped up on every side, and black and grimly all above his head, save when a red gleam shoots along the waste to make the gloomy night more terrible, loud blows the northern blast. He hears it hollow grumbling from afar, then, gathering strength, roll on with doubled might, and break in dreadful bellows o'er his head, like pithless saplings bend the vexed trees, and their wide branches crack. He shuts the door, and thankful for the roof that covers him, hies him to bed.
Thank you so much, Gillian. What a wonderfully seasonal choice of extract from Joanna Bailey. Penny says, I could do a short section from Wordsworth's At the Grave of Burns. I would also love that. And Jane Moore says, oh, do. And I second that emotion. So Penny, if you'd like to unmute yourself, if you're ready to do At the Grave of Burns, or a bit of At the Grave of Burns, we would love to hear from that.
Okay, so I'll just do a middle section from the poem. It's quite long. So this is from 1803, when Wordsworth was touring Scotland with his sister Dorothy. So this is the middle section of the poem. I mourned with thousands, but as one more deeply grieved, for he was gone, whose light I hailed when first it shone, and showed my youth how verse may build a princely throne on humble truth. Alas, where the current tends, regret pursues, and with it blends, huge cripple's hoary top ascends by Skidder seen. Neighbours we were, and loving friends we might have been. True friends, though diversely inclined, but heart with heart, and mind with mind, where the main fibres are entwined through nature's skill, may even by contraries be joined more closely still. The tear will start, and let it flow, thou poor inhabitant below. At this dread moment even so might we together have sat and talked where gowans blow, or on wild heather.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. So you're welcome to, again, if you'd like to ask questions of any of our speakers, you are welcome to. And I thought they were such rich toasts and fine entertainments that you can. Or if you want to pitch a poetry reading, you can do that too. Otherwise, I have poems sort of laid by that I can inflict on you, but no one wants to hear from me really. Oh, we would like to hear your modern version of To a Mouse, Andrew. Would you like to unmute yourself? And you can also appear in video form if you so wish, and tell us To a Mouse. Are you ready?
Yeah. Yes. I'm just trying to come up.
There you go. I can spot you now.
Actually, I'm a scientist, a retired scientist, graduated from Glasgow University, 1962, and retired a couple of years ago. But I've been writing as an amateur poet since 1978. This is my version of To a Mouse. Wee sleek and simple streamlined beast, oh, what a power lies in thy breast. The work you do at our behest, lo and behold, to us is worth much more, not less, than your weight in gold. O wondrous day when forth you burst, on Xerox star you were the first. No more those multi-keystrokes cursed would we e'er need, or concentrate with licked lips pursed till fingers bleed. Yes, truly happy was the day that we espied your progeny. When rollerball on laptop lay, we were ecstatic. Foreseeing our mobility, 'twas automatic. When next you morphed, it did the trick. You gave us both left and right click. The added wheel was pretty slick for scrolling too. Life's easier now for Tom, Harry and Dick, all thanks to you. Now 1,000 variants you have bred, using mechanical, optical or inertial head. With LEDs you now glow red, our eyes are glazing. In 3D too, I've heard it said. It's just amazing. What does the future hold in store? Of innovations there will be more. Of that there is no doubt, I'm sure. What will they be? When simple mouse becomes folklore, I'll wait and see. I wrote that in 2007. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. I don't know if you can see this, but this is a picture of my cat playing with a computer mouse, which I was reminded of in your your rendition. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Do we have any other victims / volunteers? Oh, someone has offered us an extract from Wordsworth's. Oh no, from Keats on visiting the tomb of Burns. Raina, would you like to read it out? Thanks, Julian. I'm shy. Oh gosh, would you like someone else to read it out? I can give it a go. Okay. So this is Raina's choice, and I'm reading it as I read it out, so it could go horribly, horribly wrong. But this is Keats's on visiting the tomb of Burns, smiley face. The town, the churchyard, and the setting sun, the clouds, the trees, the rounded hills all seem, though beautiful, cold, strange, as in a dream. I dreamed long ago, now new begun. The short-lived paly summer is but one, from winter's ague, for 1 hour's gleam. Though sapphire warm, their stars do never beam. All is cold beauty, pain is never done, for who has mind to relish, Minos-wise, the real of beauty, free from that dead hue, sickly imagination and sick pride, cast wan upon it. Burns, with honour due, I oft have honoured thee, great shadow, hide thy face again, I sin against thy native skies. I feel like I survived that. It was a wonderful choice, Anna. We can have there can be poetry renditions from our speakers as well. You can sort of come back again and read us a bit of poetry. Or I have poems waiting. I'll do that. Now that I've got a taste for it, I'll do a very short one from Helen Tookey's Mistletoe. So Zayneb was talking about a little market town in the prologue to her poem, which is Ormskirk, which is where Edgehill University is. And I've promised Anthony Mandel that I'm not going to make a joke about a 1-horse, 2-horse town again, so I won't. But I live a little bit away from Ormskirk in the next village along, which is called Burscough. And I was very excited when I went to Manchester one time to just flick through this book and to notice a poem in Helen Tookey's Mistletoe called At Burscough Lancashire. And I bought this book on the strength of there being a Burscough poem in it, and this makes Burscough seem very much more Gothic than my experience of it. I would say. Out on the ghost lake, what's lost is everywhere, murmuring in names on the map, tasted in salt winds that scour the topsoil, westerlies that wrenched out oaks and pines, buried now in choked black ranks, heads towards the east. Cloud shadows ripple the grasses as the Seines rippled over the mere by night, fisher voices calling across dark water. Underfoot, the flatlands' black coffers lie rich with the drowned. There we are. That was short and bittersweet, I would suggest. Please, someone suggest a poem that you could read to avoid me having to read more, or I will continue. Yes, Jim, do Don Patterson. That would be lovely.
Okay, I do apologize. It's a bit of a longer one, but it's about whiskey, and it's one of my favorites. It's called A Private Bottling. Back in the same room that an hour ago we had led, lamp by lamp, into the darkness, I sit down and turn the radio on low as the last girl on the planet still awake reads a dedication to the ships and puts on a recording of the ocean. I carefully arrange a chain of nips in a big fairy ring. In each square glass, the tincture of a failed geography, its dwindled burns and woodlands, wind fires, heather, the sklent of its wind and its salty rain, the love-worn habits of its working folk, the waveform of their speech, and by extension, how they sing, make love, or take a joke. So I have a good nose for this sort of thing. Then I will suffer kiss after fierce kiss, letting their gold tongue slide along my tongue as each gives up in turn its little song of the patient years and glass and sherry oak, the shy negotiations with the sea, air, and earth, the trick of how the peat smoke was shut inside it, like a black thought. Tonight I toast her with the extinct malts of Ardlussa, Lady Byrne, and Dallantober, and an ancient pledge of passionate indifference, wishing her health as I might wish her weather. When the circle is closed and I have drunk myself sober, I will tilt the blinds a few degrees and watch the dawn grow in a glass of liver salts, wait for the birds, the milk floats sweet nothings, then slip back to the bed where she lies curled, replace the live egg of her burning ass gently in the cold nest of my lap, as dead to her as she is to the world. Here we are again. It is precisely 12, 15, 30 years down the road, and one turn higher up the spiral chamber that separates the burnt ale and dark grains of what I know from what I can remember. Now each glass holds its micro-episode in permanent suspension, like a movie frame on acetate, until it plays again, revivified by suave connoisseurship that deepens in the silence and the dark to something like an infinite sensitivity. This is no romantic fantasy. My father used to know a man who'd taste the sea, then leave his net strung out along the bay because there was no fish in it that day. Everything is in everything else. It is a matter of attunement, as once, through the hiss and backwash, I steered the dial into the voice of God slightly to the left of Hilversum, half drowned by some big blurry waltz, the way some stars obscure their dwarf companions for centuries, till someone thinks to look. In the same way, I can isolate the feints of feminine effluvia, carrion, shite, those rogues and toxins only introduced to give the composition a little weight, as rough harmonics do the violin note, or Pluto, Charon, and the lesser saints might do to our lives, for all I know. By Christ, you would recognize their absence, as anyone would testify, having sunk a glass of North British, run off a patent still in some sleet-hammered satellite of Edinburgh, a bleak spirit. No amount of caramel could sweeten or disguise its after effect, somewhere between a blanket bath and a sad wank. There is no doubt a bar in Lothian where it is sworn upon and swallowed neat by furloughed riggers and the special police, men who hate the company of women. Oh, whiskies of Long Island and Provence, this little number catches at the throat but is all sweetness in the finish. My tongue trips first through burning brake fluid, then nicotine, pasties, diorissimo, and wet grass. Another is silk sleeves and lip service with a kick like a smacked puss in a train station. Another, the light charge and the trace of zinc tap water picks up at the moon's eclipse. You will know the time I mean by this. Because your singular absence, in your absence, has bread hard. Tonight I take the waters with the whole clan, our faceless ushers, bridesmaids, our 4 shelties, 3 now ghosts of ghosts, our douce sons and our lovely loud-mouthed daughters, who will by this late hour be fully grown, perhaps with unborn children of their own. So finally let me propose a toast, not to love, or life, or real feeling, but to their sentimental residue, to your sweet memory, but not to you. The sun will close its circle in the sky before I close my own, and drain the purely offertory glass that tastes of nothing but silence, burnt dust on the valves, and whisky.
Thanks so much for that, Jim. I think that was perfect. And I think this this event was advertised as running from 5 till 6:20, and we're nearly at the end of that. So I think sort of perhaps we could all raise a glass. I think I've finished my whiskey now, but we could all raise a glass to our wonderful speakers. That's Jerry, Darroch, Ainsley, our poet readers and poets themselves, Jim and Zayneb, and everyone who contributed to that third entertainment that I thought was really wonderful to hear so many different poems in so many different voices at this sort of event. So Skål, I was going to say. That's Danish for cheers rather than Scottish. Just before I send you off into the wild, I think I advertised this as possibly with piping, which I didn't manage to organise, but also beginning with the Selkirk Grace. And I don't know about you. I forgot about that. I'm sorry. I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to dinner now, and I've got haggis, neeps, and tatties planned. And even though I've got a Scottish surname in McInnes, my parents chose to move down to England, and when I went to primary school, any Scottish accent in me was beaten out of me in kindergarten. So I'm going to inflict my reading of the Selkirk Grace on you in order to get us ready for the dinner that I'm looking forward to if you aren't. So this is Selkirk Grace by Robert Burns, which should have been read at the beginning of the Burns Supper, but instead, perversely, I'm going to read it at the end to sort of see us off and to get us thinking about food. So some hae meat and can eat, and some would eat that want it, but we hae meat and we can eat, so let the Lord be thank it. And that, as they say, is all, folks. Thank you very much. And thank you to our speakers and poets and our readers and entertainers.